Podcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Hi, everybody. I'm Patrick Veroneau, and thank you again for joining me on another episode of Learning from Leaders. And on this episode, we're going to talk about psychological safety. And if you've ever wondered what it is or why it is so important within, I would say, organizations, communities, or homes, for that matter, then this is an episode you're going to want to stick around for. My guest is Neil Preddy, and he's an expert in this area. He's the co-founder of Aristotle Performance. He's also a managing partner for North America for System 2, which is a global consulting group focused on a more humane organization and the creation of better outcomes. I love that. Psychological safety is something that is so important in the environment, especially that we're in right now. There's so much power from this. I hope you will stick around and gain some great insight into this. Let's get into it. Thanks for being on the podcast today. We had an opportunity to talk a couple weeks ago about a topic that I think is so important today. When we started talking earlier, I was saying, as we come into 2020 here, the workplace has really experienced, I think, seismic shifts in terms of what is going on right now. And as it relates to your focus and expertise, and something that I certainly have grown to have a great interest in as it relates to organizations, is around this concept of psychological safety. And I was hoping we could really dig into that today. Really, your background in it, how do you think this is changing as we come into this decade or this era of 2020?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Patrick. I appreciate that. As we come into 2020, and as you ask that question, I can't help but think of a challenge that was put forth to me several months ago, which was to write an article on what modern leadership needs that's different from the past. And my response at that time was, what modern leadership, or how modern leadership is different, is really that it's not different at all. It's that we went through a period of time of command and control. But what made good leadership 100, 200, 500, 1,000 years ago makes good leadership now. And what it is the kind of leadership that makes people feel like their whole self is welcome, like they have something to contribute. And psychological safety is really about, can you bring your whole self into the workplace? So are leaders creating the conditions, and are organizations designed in a way to enable that, so that people can show up as their whole selves? What has changed is that the economies that we work in and the way organizations make money is really dependent on how well people communicate with each other. And psychological safety is ultimately a thing that it seems intangible. We've all had that moment where we didn't speak up, or we didn't say something. An example was shared the other day in a group call with some of the global leaders in this field, of a CEO who got up and thanked his team for buying and organized this other company, and the sale was good, or the purchase was good, and it was doing really well, and they'd never actually bought that company. And nobody corrected him because they were worried about the consequences, right? So even something so simple as that, I worked with an organization where somebody didn't speak up in a meeting, and it cost them millions of dollars because of one error that one person didn't speak up about. And the consequences go home. And now we're living in our homes and working from our homes. So I think there's this extra pressure to make things okay at work. So, this psychological safety piece that feels so intangible, it's really rooted in our human biology, the chemical responses in our body that happen when somebody says something mean or nasty, or says something that makes us otherwise not feel like we're part of the group.
And I would think, right, the whole safety piece of this is really important. You mentioned biological. One of the things that I have found interesting, and this really was probably 2 months ago at this point, and believe me, I am so into this idea of psychological safety. It makes complete sense to me. I think from the outside, somebody that doesn't really understand this is equating this with snowflakes and, you got to be soft. If you need psychological safety, right, just suck it up and you're not tough enough and we need cry rooms and all this other stuff. And what struck me was a couple months ago, I literally was watching, I believe it was a National Geographic show, and it was on a motorcycle gang in Florida. And one of the higher ups within this motorcycle gang had gone as an informant. And when they were interviewing him, he said, I decided I had to leave the organization because what I was finding was, this gang that we were part of, this well-organized gang, there was less tolerance for people having different views. And people were being killed because they were questioning what the gang was doing. And he thought, at this point, I didn't feel safe. And it was like, bingo for me. It was like psychological safety hits everybody, whether it's organized crime or, if you're in prison, or I think there is that biological component where we need to feel safe. And we didn't have it.
You're bang on. I mean, there was a quote from a board member to Elon Musk that said, and I've shared this with lots of people, no one comes up with a good idea while they're being chased by a tiger, right? But I take it one step down and say, and we also know that being part of a group is inherently better than being alone, because alone we're more likely to be chased by a tiger. And we will sell our dignity, sell our ideas, we will let go of all of those things to be part of a group, because there is such a deep-seated need to be part of a group. And, organizations work more and more in teams. That's our group. So performance in an organization happens at the team level. And we'll notice that you go from one team to another team, and one's high performing and everybody's fully engaged and switched on. And then you go to another team and it's a completely different dynamic. And we will always be tacking upwind against human nature as leaders and as organizations. But this is really one of the most foundational things of the human experience, is a desire to be part of the group. I mean, does anybody remember high school?
Yeah.
It starts young, and it's part of our human experience to want to be part of that group.
So as we're looking at coming out of 2020 at this point, let's just use March as our start point. How have you seen the shift from, let's say, a more remote workforce as being impacted by psychological safety? What does that mean in this environment that we're in right now?
I would say that the thing that I have noticed the most is groups having almost inexplicable explosions, or breakdowns, right? Where somebody shows up at a meeting and they say something and the whole thing falls apart and everybody's at each other and whatnot. And when you dig down to it, what's going on is that person was having a moment in their lives because they'd seen too much news that day. It just got to them that day. Or something happened at home and it just got to them. And they weren't given the grace by the team to sort of allow them to have their moment, because, we're all imperfect. And, those moments are more frequent, I've found, because people have been so inundated with things that cause them to feel fear. You can almost think of it as I almost think of it as your cortisol is already up at 70%. It doesn't take much for it to push over that threshold of now you need to, have a fear response with your team. So I think that's what I've noticed more of these random events where things have shown up and the team not knowing how to handle it because they're also sort of amped up already.
When you say that too, I immediately think these disagreements that may have happened in an office too, in a workplace, now, even those disagreements are in my house now. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I can't even separate that anymore in terms of a disagreement with a group of colleagues at work. That now might be in my living room at this point because I'm working remotely.
Yeah. So, I had this thought several months ago that maybe people choose their life partners as the people that they can recover from work with the best. Because, you go to work, you spend most of your life at work. It's like, why not choose the person that helps you recover from that the best? Now you're in it with them. You're in it with your partner. I'm at home all the time. My wife's downstairs. We have to create boundaries and, kind of re-social contract with each other. What's okay, what's not okay, when is it okay to make noise, when is it not okay to make noise, all these kinds of things. That's a lot of extra stuff to juggle. And for leaders who I feel are already underdeveloped by their organizations, underprepared by their organizations, have another bag put in their lap, So I think it's a lot of extra stuff for people to navigate when it was already tough to navigate.
Right. There seems to be a misalignment between leaders' expectations and behaviors and the new realities, really, of those that they need to follow them based on this environment is what I hear you saying as well.
Yeah. And I think when you say that, I think of the misalignment between organizations setting the stage for their leaders and leaders setting a stage for their people. And I'm thinking of a specific example of someone I know who was asked to do an OKR session and develop OKRs with his team. And ultimately he was actually told, this is the KPI. Go figure out how you're going to do the KPI, not create an OKR.
Right. So for those that might not know, OKR is?
Organizational key results.
Okay. And then the KPI?
Is a key performance indicator.
Got it.
Yeah. So when he walks into this room and everybody goes, so why are we here? And he's like, because the boss told us to be here. Not because there's value around creating OKRs, was not given any kind of guidance for how to facilitate a meeting. What was, the guidelines around what was expected was different from what there was like espoused values and lived values and all these sort of different competing factors. And ultimately was met with significant levels of apathy because everyone realized that this is just another way to measure us and not another way to engage us or bring us onto the team or actually improve our lives. And, he was left holding the bag without any help from above, so to speak.
Which brings me to another thought is we look at engagement numbers for the last 2 decades have been right around a third of employees within an organization are engaged. What does that look like today?
Oh, I mean, it has to be significantly lower. I hear in conversations with people how apathetic they are because as long as they do what they're told, they feel like they'll keep their job. And organizations don't thrive by having individuals who are there to just do their job so they have a job. Organizations thrive on people that really care about what they're up to. And, Amy Edmondson's work has a 2x2 where on one axis is psychological safety and the other is performance accountability. And with low performance accountability, low psychological safety, there is apathy. And as performance accountability increases, people become more anxious. With less performance accountability and more psychological safety, there is comfort. But if you have both, if you have performance accountability and psychological safety, that's where people are in what's called the learning zone. And you can create whole organizational structures that actually increase and enable a learning zone, which is where you have the highest performance. But what organizations and what people tend to do is they're apathetic and then they realize they got to pick up the pace. So there's performance accountability that's attached to them. People are on performance improvement plans and all these kinds of things. And then their anxiety goes up. And because people can't live in anxiety all the time, they try to go back to comfort. And if it doesn't work, they just go back to apathy. So they end up in this cycle of apathy, anxiety, comfort. They're sort of swimming around in this, but without actually accessing greater levels of psychological safety. They can't kind of break through that wall and develop into a sense of belonging, a sense of wholeness with their team. They don't feel engaged. And when people don't feel engaged at work, they don't feel like they have meaning. And people don't learn from that. They don't contribute from that. So they're not actually giving what they have available to give to the organization.
The environment that we're into right now, I've seen quite a bit of it and have had conversations around this. People feeling very scared about the security of their job. So if I don't have job security, if there isn't psychological safety, I'm not one that I can have that conversation of, I'm concerned about my job, because it's almost like the fight, flight, or freeze. I'm in the freeze place where I'm like, well, maybe if I just don't say anything, if I act like they won't notice and I won't raise a red flag, like a question that they're not thinking of themselves. Mm-hmm. I just had this conversation with a rep in the pharmaceutical industry, because that's an industry that right now their reps obviously aren't getting into hospitals or medical offices. So now you have thousands of reps in the US, across the country, that are basically at home and have been at home since March, and wondering really like, how long can we do this? Zoom calls really aren't that effective in that environment. How long is this going to go on? And there's not really a lot of conversation around that. So there's a lot of stress and concern about job security.
Yeah, and I think that fight, flight, or freeze response, that is that psychological safety response. And you have this primed pump with all the stress, so you dare not make a mistake. But what's ironic about that is that this is the perfect time for organizations to be making mistakes. They have a great excuse to be making mistakes and learning and developing, what works, what doesn't work. A lot of people say the same thing. Zoom doesn't work for this. And it doesn't work the same. And I think, once you're in that place where you're worried about job security, it's like anything that you can do to say, this is why it doesn't work, is almost another way to protect yourself against, trying something new and failing. Because saying it doesn't work actually protects you better than failure.
Yeah.
And it's more allowed than failure is.
So I'm going to see if we can go down track here. We know that from Gallup research, it says that 70% of my ability to stay with a company or not is directly related to the person that I report to, that manager. So if first we have to have a manager that agrees that psychological safety is important. So we'll take it from there to say, if that manager is listening to this right now, what are some of the things that manager can do to promote an environment of psychological safety?
I think number one is listening and practicing good listening, developing coach-like skills. So being able to ask good questions and really be present with the people that you're with and be with them for however they're showing up. So I mentioned before, people showing up sometimes is like really charged, and some get really easy to get triggered because of everything else that's going on in the world. Being okay with that and like accepting that that's part of the reality that you're going to have to manage as a leader. And then really holding space for inquiry, questions, getting people to talk. One of the most clear indicators of a high-functioning team versus a low-functioning team is the difference between what we call a hub and spoke style conversation or a zigzag style conversation. So being able to not have a conversation where the leader asks a question and somebody answers, the leader asks another person a question and they answer, you sort of go around the circle, and that's a hub and spoke style conversation. So if you can not have that conversation, you can have a conversation where members are asking each other questions, where there's just general inquiry around what's going on and how things could be different or better. One of the questions I often ask my team is the idea that I brought forth to everyone just not any good at all? And part of that is the goal of being humble and inviting, sort of dissenting opinions into the room and really setting the stage for people to question me. And I think that that's a critical thing for leaders to do is Amy Edmondson's work has a leadership toolkit in it, set the stage, invite participation, and respond productively. And the part where that breaks down the most often is actually in responding productively. Do you give someone the side eye? Do you make it hard for people? Just to share a story about that regarding Zoom, I worked with a CEO who was, pretty good at getting mad at people, and he would get mad through Zoom. every single person on the Zoom screen thought he was mad at them. So the whole team suffered his wrath equally. What was going on was that he was actually getting upset with the individual and not giving them any way to make it better. So this is one of the other suggestions, which is really be specific about feedback so that it's actionable and it's not targeted at the individual. And when you praise people, really praise the individual for who they are and how they show up and what they bring to the table.
From a manager standpoint, when I hear you talking about that, I immediately go to the need for that person to go first, right? As a leader, I need to show vulnerability to be able to get this group to feel as though they can do it too. If I'm not going to put myself out there, I think the group is going to hold back and say, wait a minute, I'm not going there. I'm not saying this.
I think you're bang on. You're bang on. Leaders have to go first. And the challenge for leaders is that it's often, they're often scared. One of our colleagues did a study that revealed that one of the most impactful things for the people in her study was, for the leaders, was the fear of being labeled a micromanager. So their own fears of how they were going to be labeled by their team changed how they wanted to behave into a way that was actually destructive to the team. And I think that, you asked about my experience with psychological safety, and my experience is very rooted in experiencing the human condition, what it's like to be thrown into different environments and how are people going to respond. And it really started with my first leadership position at 13 years old, where I sat down with my Army cadet section and we all sat in a circle and I said, how do we want to be as a section? And I was promptly stood up, taken outside, stood at attention and screamed at, because that's not how things are done in the Army. But leaders often suffer that. It might not be so visceral or so obvious, but leaders suffer that. And I think that really impacts teams. And it takes a big level of comfort with yourself as a leader to be able to push through that.
I find it so fascinating that you say that, at 13 and you're being hauled out because that's not the way it's done. And I immediately go back to 3 different high-ranking military officers, 1 in the Navy, 2 in the Army, that I've had on the podcast. And all 3 of them spoke to the fact that, yes, they had legitimate authority. They had the title to be able to tell somebody what to do, but that was what they used last because they knew that it wasn't going to get real buy-in from people. Yes, you'll do it because I said so, but it won't look the same as if you want to do it. And if I can get you to want to do this, it's going to elevate all of us. It's going to look completely different. They had that confidence, I think, in themselves to know I shouldn't have to tell you what to do. And if I ask you involvement type questions and approaches and behaviors, we're going to end up in a better place.
What's interesting is that you've keyed on to the next level. And obviously these military officers know it at a subterranean level within themselves as well. That same study that I referred to, where managers were afraid of being labeled a micromanager, the issue was actually that because of that, they didn't establish authority. And because they didn't establish authority, which enables you to have, they had to use their power from title to manage the team.
It's like this paradigm shift.
It's completely different. And authority is such a different thing to wield than power. If you were to take away all titles, the natural leaders would rise to the top and some toxic ones, but that's a whole other conversation, and actually a pretty small portion of the population. Most people are, quote unquote, air quotes, toxic simply because they're not skilled or feel able to establish authority.
If we shift things now and look from an employee standpoint, right, who really wouldn't want to try and create an environment of more psychological safety unless you're somebody that's part of a team that you're bully or somebody that wants to keep that sense of control over the group. But how do you recommend as an individual trying to have this promoted as part of your team, this level of psychological safety? Because that's got to be much more difficult.
I think it is in a lot of ways much more difficult, but I think there is some leadership. People talk about everyday leadership. Oh, we're all leaders. Well, not everybody is a natural leader. but there are things you can do that can make your team feel more stable, more secure, more able. Leaders obviously wield biggest impact on that. But, what's okay to say, what's not okay to say, having members establish boundaries, hey, that wasn't cool, is actually kind of a good way to approach establishing healthy boundaries between people and what's okay on the team. And just being in relationship with each other. Often I worked with a team where the people had worked together for 6 years, and the one gentleman did not know that the other guy's daughter had autism, for example. So he had no idea after working 6 years together that his colleague had a home life that was actually quite challenging, and he had to learn all these different things from the daughter that had this. And it was a really interesting dynamic as a result, because they just didn't know each other. They simply didn't know each other. So they couldn't have honest conversations. They couldn't be vulnerable with each other. So there was a breakdown between members. So getting to know people, especially over Zoom, having that water cooler time, I often suggest that team members set up Slack time with each other where they go for a walk together on the phone, because they're not on that video call where they have to use extra, calories to read what's going on over the Zoom screen. They're walking the same direction. People tend to solve problems that way, and getting in relationship with each other is really something that can build that camaraderie regardless of what the leader is up to. And leaders often will sort of follow suit. They'll be like, holy cow, this team is different, and they can be nudged in the right direction that way.
We're like icebergs. We see about 10% of each other, and the other 90% of who we are sits below the water. And I will jokingly say that the only way you find out what else this person is about is you have to stick your head in the water. And that oftentimes takes work, and it can be painful to do that. But I do believe, as you're saying, when we have a better understanding of who we are, there's an opportunity, I think, in this situation. What if this is somebody that, maybe leaves early on certain dates and you didn't know why, and now you find out that it's because of physical therapy or, some type of event that they have to go to for one of their kids. It changes how you view that person, right? Because it's not as though this person's a slacker. It's this person has other obligations that need to be taken into account. I think it's so important.
Yeah. Well, and I think as you say that, I can't help but think that those people are usually the ones that actually are the most committed to their job. And here this other team member is often going, oh, what a slacker, what a this, what a that. And studies show that those people that have those obligations often do the most work because they're trying to make up for that time. They take it home with themselves and stuff like that. So you have this breakdown in relationship, but not a breakdown in performance.
Yeah. And often I think we fall back to our unconscious biases when that happens, right? I just make a value judgment on you because it's the easiest thing for me to do, as opposed to taking the time to really understand what is going on here. And I think that becomes more difficult in this environment if we're working remotely. I think we're starting to see the real value of the water cooler conversations that provided around belongingness and connection.
Well, I mean, a mentor of mine, Darren Jacklin, said to me once, you can say anything to people in relationship because you have the relationship to make mistakes. And that stands true. And time again, we talk about psychological safety, and it's always, the examples are all these massive issues like Wells Fargo, like Volvo, like Boeing. I mean, they're catastrophic, but it's often the sarcastic comment that's catastrophic for us personally that actually has the most impact. A team I worked with had a sarcastic comment was made between two members, and the one guy took it personally, and they didn't talk to each other for 6 months.
Right.
6 months. We've worked with teams where members didn't talk to each other for 5 years, and they had to talk through intermediaries. But those are the moments that actually really affect organizational outcomes and people. And that sarcastic comment was made, but on the other side, there was an individual who didn't give him any grace. They didn't give him any leeway. And, you mentioned the iceberg, and I often refer to, we talked about KPIs and OKRs earlier. That'll get you down to the surface level of the water when it comes to performance. But there's an iceberg of opportunity below the surface that psychological safety helps access, and that's that collective knowledge that's accessed through that portal that really changes how organizations function and how they go home. You know, even down to the point where a lot of people go home for medical reasons and call in sick and stuff like that, and they stop doing that.
Yeah. I can only think of, you mentioned a verbal example, right? Somebody says something sarcastic. I think about the nonverbals of somebody in a meeting rolling their eyes when somebody else says something. And even if that person doesn't see it, it still signals to the rest of the group, this is not a safe place to go against the grain or to think outside of the norms here or to throw up new ideas, because this is what happens when you're not looking. I could be that person that's getting the eyes rolled. So it's almost like we kill the goose. That's it.
Yeah.
Done. And we never know about it, right? It never comes to the surface. It's just, you know what happened. I'm not coming with an idea anymore.
Yeah. And I think you draw on something this is a moment for leaders. As a leader, you're in the room and one of your members rolls their eye. What do you do? And I think it's really critical to bring that, hey, John, you rolled your eyes. What's that about? Yeah. You know, and exploring it with some curiosity instead of anger, frustration, or reprimand. You know, if you can explore that with curiosity, I mean, curiosity is the foundational root of learning.
Which takes a very confident leader to be able to do that without being somebody that is worried about getting derailed or sucked into a conflict themselves that's going to end in an unhealthy way.
I totally agree. I always ask, what is the muscle you're flexing? Those managers who were scared of being micromanagers, the muscle they were flexing was their own fear, and their own fear was reflected in their teams. The managers who reflect the muscle of like, okay, this is terrifying for me personally, but I know that it's in service of the team. So I'm going to do it anyways. Here I go. You know, they're actually showing to their team that it's okay to push through that wall and, you know, expect that the other person on the other side of that question is going to actually respond like an adult because you're treating them like one.
Right. As we sort of wrap things up here and we're talking again about psychological safety, if there was one behavior that you think really is one that is most valuable here, what would that be?
Ooh. You know, I might actually say sarcasm, partly because of my own journey, but partly because I've seen a lot of damage from it on team. Some people don't get the joke. Some people get the joke and don't like it. But sarcasm is almost always at the expense of someone else. And saying something that's sarcastic or even otherwise that is somehow at the expense of someone else, not their idea, not their thoughts or their question, but who they are, is very destructive. And we have a society that sees it as natural and joking and fun, and it is actually quite destructive. And leaders and members of teams will often try to use humor to break tension. But that sarcasm is often reflected by some kind of insecurity that we see in ourselves. So it's kind of a twofer. It's getting people to reflect on why they feel a need to be sarcastic and also maybe shift a behavior that is commonly destructive for the team.
So what's interesting, I will say, I think you answered or thought I asked, what is the most damaging thing to psychological safety? And I would actually be curious, what do you think is the skill that or behavior that is probably most important for developing psychological safety?
When it comes to developing psychological safety, I think it might sound a bit weird, but the check-in, getting teams to do the check-in, bringing your whole self. So just the act of inviting people to do a check-in, but a check-in isn't just, hey, I'm Neil.
Checked in.
But really like, this is what's going on for me right now. Those teams that have individuals, well, everyone right now almost, who show up at some points in time and they've had too many cups of coffee, you know, and they're wired. You know, they've watched too many news articles or read too many news articles, or they just been on Instagram all morning and they're sort of flustered. Or they just got an email from someone outside or inside the organization that's really set them on a different path in their day. If you can take 2 breaths for each person in the meeting to say, hi, I'm Neil. I had too many cups of coffee today. I'm a little wired. My kid was running around. My energy is really anxious and stressed out. If I've brought myself into the room that way, people know a little bit more about me, know a little bit more about how I'm showing up, and they can have the opportunity to reflect on that. If I say something that's a little bit cut short or a little bit sharper, he did say he was a little bit wired today, so it can build some buffer around how we interact with one another, as well as demonstrating that we want to bring our whole selves into work.
Yeah. When I hear you make that suggestion about check-in, it reminds me of a group that I'm involved with now. I'm not a facilitator anymore for them, but we used to, as a group, have to go around and do a check-in before we met with families that we were helping. It was called the Center for Grieving Children. Mm-hmm. And the whole point of doing the check-in was to release anything that I was dealing with that would prevent me from being present in the moment for the group that I was with. And as I hear you say that, again, I think it would probably take there would need to be small steps for that to happen, where groups feel like I can really check in. But the power in that of, if I do have things going on, if I can bring that up to the group before we start, maybe it does provide an opportunity for me to just be more present and let go of that. And also the group understand where I'm coming from today, that I might not be 100% here today, but now at least you know why. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I think because what I'm hearing from your response is that not only is it a place to bring up what you don't want, but to bring up an energy that you do want. I had a meeting this morning where someone said, whoa, hold on. The energy here is really low, really tired. Why don't we try to access some of the energy we had in this other meeting? What would it be like to do that? And we just simply spent 1 minute each. So 5 minutes later, how we were all in the meeting was different. And the results were amazing.
Yeah, just small shifts. It really is small shifts. And I think that's the important thing here that we talk about. Psychological safety or, a lot of this stuff is not about making these major 180-degree changes. They're just tweaks, just small things that could be done that really, I think, will make such a difference as everybody I know looks forward to probably exiting 2020. Well, what's 2021 going to look like? Is it going to be more of the same, or what are we going to do to change it? And we can start doing that right now.
I often say to people, if the first step seems too big, just make the step smaller. There's no need to be.
I love that. That's great. And on that note, I want to thank you for taking the time and really sharing your expertise in regards to psychological safety and how to bring it to life within organizations, because I think it's so important. And if it's done there, again, to me, I look at this as we need this everywhere in our personal lives, in the communities. When we have psychological safety, we're richer for it. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Patrick. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.